Yo, what's good, YouTube? What's good? Stormy B-Man here, and I am back. Welcome to another episode of the Three Wise Men of Boxing. For this Saturday, we have April 11th, 2020, and want to say good morning to everybody that's out there listening. And glad to see you guys have come out to join us this morning. And this is an episode where we're calling Madison Square Garden, boxing's Mecca, okay? And want to say salute to everybody that's come out this morning to check us out. Got my man Scrapbook Boxing here with me. Curtis is still a little bit under the weather, but he's doing much better. He's nursing himself back to health, so he'll be joining us at a later time. But I just want to say good morning, Scrapbook. How you doing this morning, brother?
I'm good, Stormy. How you feel, my brother? Salute to the chat.
Oh, man, I'm doing pretty good, man. Glad to be here. Glad to be able to do another episode of the show and talk about more history of the sport, man. Just totally delighted. And I think we got a special show for everybody today talking about Madison Square Garden, boxing's Mecca.
Yeah, Madison Square Garden has a history all within its own when it comes to boxing. You know, it's funny. It started in 1879, and it was a P.J. Barnum. He was the guy who developed a circus. He had a small circus under tents, and he wanted a bigger housing for it. And at that time, when they first developed that first garden, it was 10,000 seat capacity. Just imagine that, 10,000 seats, and it went from 10,000 to 20,789. That's amazing. So we're going to be getting into a lot of fights, how it got started, up until probably Andrew Reese and Joshua, if you want. So I'm ready to cook whenever you are, brother.
Oh man, it's a wonderful thing. A lot of us know Madison Square Garden, not just from, and forgive me, people, that Stormy B-Man got a little bit of a tooth issue going on this morning, so some of my words may come out a little funny, but that's the explanation. I haven't been drinking, okay? But no, I was going to say most of us know the Garden for one reason or another. If you're a sports fan, the Garden has been home to professional sports, not just for the teams that are based in New York City, but events of sports, you know, WrestleManias and things like that. And it's just ultimate fighting. The Garden is really a place, I guess you can almost say it's like the modern day Coliseum, you know, from Rome. That's our Coliseum here in the U.S. What do you think about that, Scrap?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a well-missed place. The Barclays Center now covers a lot of fights that's in New York, but Madison Square Garden, wow, the amount of fights that garden had covered, all three, they had 4 different locations, but all 3 locations for boxing was amazing. Amazing. And, you know, it all started Madison Square Park. It was an area down there right off of 5th Avenue, and it started moving all around. It went to 50th Street. 1960, you had Buster Mathis and Joe Frazier. They started that new garden off. And then it moved over to 33rd and 32nd Street. But it's so much history of the garden. And, you know, I'll kick it off whenever you're ready, brother.
Please do. I've actually uploaded one of the original visuals of the 2-building garden that was originally established in the 1800s. You want to start from there?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think this visual here might be the current one. I don't know, I'm buffering, so maybe it's a different one than you see.
But no, it's the one, when it comes up, it's in black and white. It's in black and white.
Oh, okay. Black and white. Okay, I'm looking at the one that's current. All right, so basically in 1879 is when the first garden started. It started off in 1879. But in December 14th, 1920, you had Jack Dempsey, who knocked out a fighter by the name of Bill Brennan. knocked him out in 12 rounds. That was a big deal because it was a new building. They wanted to see how the ticket sales would be because most of those fights were outside. And before boxing was legal, of course, it had to be on docks and backwoods. But it was the first real building that they really had that they can house a capacity of 10,000 people. So that was a big deal. 1925, January 9th, 1925, you had a promoter by the name of Tex Ricker. And he built the structure of $4,075,000. And that fight was December 11th, 1925. You had Paul Berlenbach and Jack Delaney. Now, that was a light heavyweight championship contest. That was also a big deal because you never had a contest like that that would draw as many ticket sales as it did. December 25th, 1925, Theater Tiger Flowers had went up and he tried to fight a light heavyweight by the name of Mike Mateague. And Mike Mateague would take the title away from Badalinski. And what's funny about that, he was Irish. St. Patrick's Day in Ireland is when he took the title away from Badalinski. Figure that. But that fight took place December 25th, 1925 between Tiger Flowers and Mike Mateague at Madison Square Garden. You had 38 fights in 1926. Started off with Dave Shade and Roland Todd. Then you had Jack Delaney and Eddie Bay Visco. These are all championship fights, Stormy and chat. June 24th, 1926, Mickey Walker, the toy bulldog. He had faced Joe Dundee. Joe Dundee took the title away from Pete Latzo. And they were going back and forth between Mickey Walker and Pete Latzo. So that was a big deal. These are all championship fights that they're having. He had 38 fights in the year of 1926, including Harry Greb and Tiger Flowers, February 26, 1926. That was special because Tiger Flowers became the first black middleweight champion in boxing history. It took place in Madison Square Garden. August 19th, 1926, Tiger Flowers had faced Harry Greb again, and that was the last time. They fought a total of 3 times. First time was a draw, and 2 were unanimous decisions that were given to Tiger Flowers. Tiger Flowers was a southpaw. He was called the Georgia Deacon, and he was pretty tall for his weight division, but he was a master boxer. And all that happened in New York's Madison Square Garden. It has quite a history. Before that, you had Boyles Acres and Yankee Stadium and Polo Grounds. You didn't really have the kind of housing that you needed to have, an indoor arena to have for boxing because they had a lot of rain dates. As a matter of fact, Jack Dempsey fought Gene Tunney in Philadelphia. And that was 1926. And they almost got rained out. It started raining. So it was very important that they had an indoor arena. You had a fighter by the name of Sid Terrace and Eddie Wallace. I'm trying to think of these guys as I'm speaking to you. All worthy championship quality fights. That wasn't a title fight, but that was a neighborhood rivalry. September 1st, 1927, Tiger Flowers and Lee Anderson. Lee Anderson was a colored light heavyweight champion, and Tiger Flowers was trying to get his title. Because before that, Johnny Dundee and Tony Canzaneri, October 24th, 1927. December 12th, 1927, you had Tommy Loughlin. He's from Philadelphia. He was called the Philly Phantom. He was in a ring with a fighter by the name of Jimmy Slattery. He was from Buffalo, New York. That was quite some fight. And at that time, Tommy Loughlin was trying to get the America's Light Heavyweight Championship belt that was left over from Gene Tunney when Gene Tunney had fought Tom Heaney. Tom Heaney was from New Zealand. And that was the last fight that Gene Tunney had, and he vacated the belt, and all these guys were scrambling from that belt. Jack Sharkey and Tom Loughlin and Jimmy Slattery and all of them.
Hey, Scrap, I have a question to ask you.
Yes.
As these fights, became bigger, is there a reason that Madison Square Garden became the place that they would have them as opposed to somewhere else in the country? Was it because of the way the building was designed and the capacity it could hold, or was it something to do with the region of where people would come out to endorse or support fights more? What can you give us on that aspect of the sport and why the Garden became the venue for boxing?
Well, because it was in an indoor arena and they were able to house 10,000 spectators back in 1879. And that was a big deal. So they started opening up more and more capacity as they moved buildings around. But they realized the indoor arenas were the way to go because you didn't have to have any. They were having a lot of cancellations of rain delays and threats of thunderstorm. And and, other terroristic threats. So they figured an indoor arena would be your best bet. And Madison Square Garden, when it held 10,000 spectators, they realized they can get a lot of money out of that. And it started growing from there. Like I said, at this point in time, it was over 20,700 seating capacity. That's amazing. And they had the big house, and they also had a little section called the Felt Forum. But I'll get to that in a moment as to what fights took place and translated. But that's the reason why they chose Madison Square Garden. It became an indoor arena, and they can house so many people and get so many ticket sales.
Okay, I got you. As you were speaking, I was able to cycle through some of those images. Maybe you're able to see them now if the stream is caught up, because sometimes there's a little bit of a delay.
Yeah, I'm buffering right now, but that's fine. I'll catch up with it.
Yeah.
No problem. Yeah. Where you at now as far as the visuals?
I've got the Madison Square Garden
Madison
3.
Square Garden 3.
Oh, okay, great. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And as we talk about this, the fights and the fighters, what would you have to say about those who became the marquee names of the Garden? I know like Lewis had 8 successful title defenses there. So could you tell us a little more about Garden favorites, people that, fighters that people love to see to come there to watch them work their magic?
Well, yeah, Mickey Walker, the toy bulldog, June 24th, 1926, he fought a fighter by the name of Joe Dundee. Why that was a big deal? Because Mickey Walker, he had become the middleweight champion when he defeated Tiger Flowers in 26. But the thing is, he was a favorite out of Elizabeth, New Jersey. He was always talked about. And when he came over to the Garden, he was what you call a windmill, almost like Harry Greb. He never stopped throwing punches. He was very short. He had very thick legs, so he was very powerful. And they wanted to see that kind of an action. So when he fought Joe Dundee had fought Pete Latzo. And it was one of those things where I'm trying to give, like if you say Marvin Hagler and Ray Leonard, that's the kind of feeling they got when they heard those two names clash. Well, that's what you had with Mickey Walker. He was around a lot of good fighters with Harry Greb and Pete Latzo and Joe Dundee and Tiger Flowers. So he was a marquee name. You mentioned Joe Louis. Joe Louis, 1935. He was a big name for Paulino Escadon. And they couldn't wait because he was a big amateur star. So they couldn't wait to see him. And Jim Jacobs, he was the Micah Jacobs. I'm saying Jim Jacobs. Mike Jacobs was his actual promoter. And Jim Johnson was the one who ran Madison Square Garden. But Mike Jacobs, he really had a lot of pull. So he was able to get Joe Louis inside that Garden. And everybody wanted to see Joe Louis coming out of the amateurs. So he was the big star. Henry Armstrong was another big star. He always fought in Madison Square Garden. Bo Jack had 21 main event fights in Madison Square Garden. Second to him was Tippy Larkin with 19. So you had a lot of big names that fought in Madison Square Garden. But those are just an example of some of the names that was very popular at that time.
Yes, sir. What would you say prior to the Joe Louis era? What would you have said that was the marquee fight at the Garden, history-wise, historically, prior to Joe Louis era?
Prior to the Joe Louis era, you had Henry Armstrong. He fought 4 times at Madison Square Garden. March 12, 1937 against Mike Belois. March 19, 1937 against Aldi Sporley. I'll tell you about that fight. Henry Armstrong had 27 fights in 1937, 26 by knockout. The only fighter he didn't knock out in 1927 was a fighter by the name of Aldi Sporley. And it's funny because he fought him 2 other times and knocked him out both times, 44 and 45. But Henry Armstrong was a big name in Madison Square Garden. But before him, if you want to go back, Tiger Flowers is a big name. He was the first black middleweight champion of all times when he defeated Harry Greb. You had Jack Dempsey when he fought Bill Brennan. That was a big deal. Because like I said, Jack Dempsey, he was a really well-known fighter. He won the heavyweight championship in 1919 when he defeated Jess Willett. Knocked him out in 3.5 rounds. Couldn't come out for the 4th round. Broke his jaw in 2 pieces, his ribs in 3 pieces, broke his eye socket. I mean, it was a brutal fight. So he had a big name coming into that Garden. But those are the big names. Jack Sharkey, Jack Johnson, Tiger Flowers, Joe Louis and Henry Armstrong. Those are big names before Ray Robinson came around in 1940, October 4th, 1940.
Man, I'm just sitting here cringing with you calling out those injuries, bro. You know, I just have a toothache, and I can imagine your jaw being broken in a couple of pieces. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's something to be said. Why do you think that though it had been moved a couple of times, the Garden was able to endure? You know, like sometimes, like even now, we've had in the past 30 years, we've had stadiums like here in Chicago, we had Comiskey Park, right? It was like they couldn't wait to tear that down and open up a new facility. And the seating in the new facility was so poor in those upper decks that people were getting like vertigo and stuff going up there because of the way it was designed. And then they had to bring architects in to kind of correct that design on those upper deck balconies. Why do you think it's like now so important that they get rid of the classic venues or whatever instead of just remodeling inside and upgrading and stuff like that? Because as you can see with the Garden, with what they've done over the years with it has endured, but it has remained what it is through and what it has been through history. Whereas other facilities now, it just seems like they're going for the glitz and you know, the attractiveness of modern technology and stuff like that. What do you have to offer on that?
Well, 9/11 didn't help Madison Square Garden because of the amount of money it cost to restructure, the situation that happened there in 2001. And right after Felix Trinidad and Bernard Execution Hopkins, I was in the second row of that fight, and it was such a thrill. You had all the police and all the firemen, but it cost that city so much money. So when Jay-Z went partnership with the Barclays Center over in Brooklyn, and the Nets went over there, the New York Nets or New Jersey Nets, before they moved over to the Barclays Center, that now became the prestige for boxing, unfortunately. And that's what hurt Madison Square Garden. It hurt it so much that the Daily News couldn't even, the papers stopped selling, and they couldn't even fund the Golden Gloves anymore. And so I think that hurt the Garden a lot. But it was running good up until that point. But, the money, once 9/11 hit, I think it did a lot of damage to the venues in Madison Square Garden.
Yeah. That Hopkins and Trinidad fight was a classic as well because of how the promotion went building up that fight, and then, the turnout that Felix Trinidad was able to get in lieu of support, all the Latin supporters for him and the rest of the people who really basically supported boxing at its best, matching up quality fighters against one another. That was one of those reasons for the success of that promotion, I believe. And again, as I have spoken about, during boxing being on its current hiatus, when the sport returns, some people are talking about how, it's not going to be the same and this and that. Boxing will endure because people have always admired watching violence, and they'll pay for it. And it's the sick fabric of us as a society, but it's very true. But where I was going with that is this: with everyone wondering about how boxing will fare, if they put on the fights that people want to see, boxing will have no trouble whatsoever. Boxing would be the #1 sport in the world if they would deliver the goods on the fights that people wanted to see on a consistent basis. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Boxing is not going anywhere. The issue with boxing, you have too many promoters that are trying to suck up the money. You always had that. Tex Vickard, he was one of the first ones that actually started doing that. Give an example. Jack Dempsey was supposed to be fighting Harry Wills, 1924. There was a contract already agreed. And Tex Vickard made an excuse. He wanted to have it at Boyles Acres, which is in New Jersey. And he made an excuse that he didn't want to have any riots going on. What happened with Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries in 1910, July 4th. He didn't want to have that. That was the excuse he made. Wasn't the case, but that was his excuse. But you're always going to have that. You had Don King and Bob Arum, and I can go on and on and on with all the promoters, Jim Norris. But you always had that when it comes to boxing. They want to make as much money as they can. So that's the problem today. The guys want the biggest purses, so you're going to have less fights because of the tax reasons and everything else. But boxing for its true form, that's gone. That's gone. If you want to be entertained and you want to hang out with some of your family members or what have you, and have some popcorn and drink some liquor, or whatever the case is, you wait once a year for a good fight. That's what you get. But back in the days, you had fights. I told you, 38 fights in 1927 alone. 38 fights. These are all world-class championship fights. There were 15-rounders, 10-rounders. You even had the 4-round preliminary fights that had up-and-coming names that wound up becoming champions that fought each other. It's a different era. So boxing will never go away. It's not the same, but it's always going to be around.
Yeah. When you talk about Madison Square Garden, now we move into like the Joe Louis era. Like I said, he had 8 successful defenses there. What was it about Louis that he seemed to have his feet, firmly planted in the Garden as a main site venue for him? We know that he reigned for 12 years, but what was it about him that the people would, come out to see Joe? Is it because of his gentlemanly approach and everything? And behind the scenes, we know why he behaved like he behaved. But I'm just saying, for that public persona and image, do you think it was that? Do you think it was like his workmanlike manner that he went about his business? The beautiful violence that he would inflict upon his opponents, where his fights could end like that, when Joe delivered knockout blows and things like that. Give us a little bit of what your thoughts are about Joe and why he was a Garden mainstay.
Sure. To give you a quick example before I get to Joe Louis, Sonny Liston was going to face Floyd Patterson. And the NAACP did not want that fight because they didn't want the image of a Sonny Liston representing black culture. Going back to Joe Louis, in 1935, he faced Max Baer, New York's Madison Square Garden. Right before that fight, he got married to Marva Trotter. And he was such a gentleman. That was the first time he was really on television. Not so much television, but the video. And he was such a gentleman. The way he carried himself. He had 2 separate audiences. He had the black audience and the white audience. And the white audience didn't want to see another Jack Johnson. That happened in 1908 when he faced a fighter by the name of Tommy Burns. So when he came around, of course, he was given a set of rules, kind of a person. He wasn't the kind of person that spoke loud about his opponents or whatever the case was. So they fell in love with that, with him for that. Now, the black audience in Harlem and all of the southern regions didn't have a lot of role models at that time. So anywhere Joe Louis went, they went. On the radio, on the newspapers. He was the biggest selling newspaper articles. Even if he had a small article, they would buy the entire newspaper just to read what was said about Joe Louis. And that was a big deal at that time. So he was the big star in urban America and suburban America.
So do you think he would have had, he had that certain amount of time off for the military. Do you think he would have had more challenges, more tougher challenges, had that not been a part of what became his career? Because, they brought him in, but they didn't put him on the front lines for battle or anything like that. He was doing a lot of exhibitions and stuff. But do you think that was because he was so good, or what are your thoughts about that? Because history would kind of repeat itself when Ali came along, but for different reasons.
Let me tell you something. Joe Louis fought over 125 exhibitions in the Army. A lot of the men that he was in there with were world-class fighters. You just don't know about them because they're not on his record of the 25 title defenses that he had. But Joe Louis was in there with some really, really good fighters in his exhibitions. The reason why they didn't put a lot of black fighters in with Joe Louis during that time is because, obviously, racism. They didn't want to make money. They figured black fighters didn't sell tickets. That's the whole thing. They didn't want them to become champions and have opportunities. Joe Louis was half. He was Cherokee Indian. He could have went either way as far as the establishment was concerned. So that's why he was a very good opportunity for the establishment, if you will. But Joe Louis threw very short punches. He was a knockout artist. He was a very clean fighter. He didn't have to fight dirty. He can hit you with a beautiful combination, and the fight is over. Once Joe Louis got you hurt, the fight was over. Everybody wanted to see that. You didn't have fighters like that at that time. He was the first one who actually came out during that time who fought that way. So they couldn't wait to see Joe Louis. Joe Louis would sell out any arena in New York that you had. That's why he had to go to Yankee Stadium, because they couldn't fill the seats anymore for Joe Louis. Madison Square Garden didn't have the capacity that a Yankee Stadium would have. So that's why he moved over to Yankee Stadium. But when he was in Madison Square Garden, he sold out the Garden every time.
Awesome. Totally awesome.
Give you a quick example, Stormy. He fought a fighter by the name of Nathan Mann, February 12, 1938. This was the same year, and this is when he was competing with Henry Armstrong. He knocked out Nathan Mann with a beautiful left hook. Now, Nathan Mann was from New Haven, Connecticut. And he bounced off the ropes, and he hit him with a left hook. Nathan Mann didn't even get up. And he was in a hospital for 3 weeks. This is the type of fighter he was. You never knew what kind of fight you were going to see with Joe Louis. You knew it was going to be a knockout, but you didn't know if the guy was going to do a 360, if he was going to do a backflip when he hit him. He was an unbelievable puncher, Joe Louis. So he would sell out tickets every day of the week.
Wow. Well, the visual I just put up on the screen is a photo of Joe Louis in his last fight against Marciano, and that took place in the Garden. Why don't you give us a recap and a recount of how that went and where these fighters were at their times when they met, their paths crossed?
Saddest night in Madison Square Garden history. Took place 1951. And I think I said this once before. 1951 was one of the most upsetting years in boxing history till this day, because all of the world champions that started in 1940, they all lost their belts that year. And to see Joe Louis get knocked out in the 8th round, and he got knocked out of the ropes with Marciano, was very sad, because he didn't have to have that fight. It was because of the tax problems he had. He felt that he was entitled to owe them. It's why he fought Marciano. Marciano needed him. He didn't need Marciano. But that was a very sad night. Marciano, at that time, he was striving for the heavyweight championship belt. And he got that opportunity the following year when he fought Jersey Joe Walcott. And he knocked out Walcott in 13th round. That was an unbelievable fight, that Walcott fight in Marciano. But the Marciano and Joe Louis fight was the saddest. You didn't have a dry eye in the house. It was one of the most saddest moments, because that was Joe Louis's last fight. And when he walked out of Madison Square Garden, the marquee said Joe Louis and Rocky Marciano. He just kept walking, and he never looked back. And he went downhill from there as far as health is concerned. He started seeing, almost like a George Foreman, started seeing demons in his head and everything else. But that was a sad moment in 1951 with Joe Louis. And just to piggyback off what I'm saying, when I said all the world champions, 1940, you had Ezra Charles he turned professional in 1940, and he won a title in 1949 from Jersey Joe Walcott, NBA version of it. But he had to solidify it in Yankee Stadium in New York with Joe Louis. And it went 15 rounds, 15 brutal rounds. He became the world champion, but he lost his title in 1951 to Jersey Joe Walker with a vicious left hook. You also had Ike Williams, turned professional in 1940. He defeated Juan Zarita, lightweight championship belt, but he lost his title to Jimmy Carter in 1951. You also had Sugar Ray Robinson, turned professional in 1940, and he defeated Jake LaMotta. He defeated him in 1951. But he lost his title to Randy Turpin in 1951. So 1951, it was unbelievable. Sandy Sadler, same thing with Willie Pep. Willie Pep turned professional in 1940. And, he wound up losing his title in 1951 to Joe Sandy Sadler. And here you go, Joe Louis and Rocky Marciano. Unbelievable year. But that was a sad moment for that Joe Louis and Rocky Marciano fight.
Yes, sir. I want to take a moment to acknowledge Ronald Finkley, who has sent a PayPal donation in. He says, I had to catch the three wise men. Salute. Thank you for your donation there, Ronald Finkley. Appreciate you, bro. Yeah, another fighter who was known for being in the Garden, Sugar Ray Robinson, scrapbook, and here I've put up a visual of Robinson looking quite spry against LaMotta at the Garden. What can you tell us about those two gentlemen whose paths crossed a couple of times in some ferocious matchups? What are your recollections of those and in the Garden?
Now, you asking me Jake LaMotta and Ray Robinson?
Yes, sir.
Oh, yeah. Ray Robinson, he faced Jake LaMotta in 1942, Madison Square Garden. Just to take a step back for a second, he had his professional debut October 4th, 1940, on the undercard of Fitzy Zivic and Henry Armstrong. And they had a rematch, Henry Armstrong and Fitzy Zivic in 41. Ray Robinson was in the second row, and that's when he decided he wanted to get even with Fitzy Zivic. And he also wanted to have a title of his own, and that was against Sammy Engat. But Sammy Engat didn't make weight. But 1942, that was some fight. Ray Robinson won that fight, but he barely won the fight. Jake LaMotta was one of the most underrated defensive fighters. You couldn't hit Jake LaMotta. And he was really a light heavyweight, but he wound up becoming a middleweight. Ray Robinson was a welterweight at that time when he faced Jake LaMotta in 1942. Jake LaMotta in 1939, he was a light heavyweight when he won the Diamond Gloves. Call them the Diamond Gloves. And Ray Robinson was a featherweight in 1939 when he beat Louis Spider Valentine in the Golden Gloves. So it goes to show you the weight disparity. But in 42, Ray Robinson had defeated Jake LaMotta. 43, he lost to Jake LaMotta. He got basically punched out of the ring. And he managed to get back in time, but he lost on a close decision. 3 weeks later, he wound up defeating LaMotta. They had some rivalry, I'll tell you. Jake LaMotta and Sugar Ray Robinson.
Hold on. 1 second, Scrapbook. I have to say this with an inner chiming here. 3 weeks later. Now, you can't get these guys today to fight 6 months later. You know what I mean? So tell us about that. To have a three-week turnaround when two fighters that are fighting at the highest level of the sport competing against one another. To have a 3-week turnaround.
Well, Ray Robinson, between that fight, he fought a fighter by the name of Jackie Wilson. Now, Jackie Wilson was some fighter. He was, see, the names that I'm naming, unless you know them and know their records, you won't understand who's Jackie Wilson. Jackie Wilson was like a guy, I'm trying to think of today, would probably be like somebody could check and probably help me. I'm trying to think of some of these guys today who you can compare him with, of a quality fighter. And he fought him in between the fight between Jake LaMotta, the second time they fought, and the third time they fought, that 3-week stretch. So he was always active, Ray Robinson. But 3 weeks later, see, Robinson had to get that get back. You know, he wasn't the kind of guy that would settle for a loss. He had to get you back. That's why he had one of the most promising reigns of rematches in boxing history. But the guys have rematches all the time. All the time. You had Tiger Flowers and Harry Greb. They fought 3 times. Jersey Joe Walker, Eddie Charles, they fought 3 times. Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali fought 3 times. I mean, it wasn't unusual. Obi Walker, I did a profile on him the other day. Obi Walker, unbelievable, fought 13 times. Can you believe that? With Elmer Violent Ray, Black Murderers So Heavyweight, 13 times. So this is the type of thing I'm talking about. When you have fighters of that quality, it's nothing to have, rematches. Sam Langford, he fought Harry Wills 22 times. I mean, this is a whole different conversation with modern fighting and fighters of the past. But that wasn't unusual at all.
That's amazing, man. 22 times. Wow. Well, my latest visual I put up on the screen is an image of Riddick Bowe in agony on the canvas after he had been hit below the belt several times by Andrew Golota in their famous fight at the Garden that led to a brawl and a riot. Can you tell us about your recollections of that?
Absolutely. I was at that fight. Unbelievable fight. It was July 11th, 1996. Riddick Bowe, Andrew Golota. And that was their second fight. I think, was it their first fight or the second fight? It might have been their first fight. And I was at the first fight only. And I got to tell you something, man. The brawl that happened after that fight was unbelievable. Andrew Golota kept on hitting Riddick Bowe low. And he wasn't really penalized. I think one point was taken away from him, but you can't erase a low blow. You can't erase that. And he just kept getting hit low. And Andrew Golota was winning the fight. All he had to do was just keep it clean, but he couldn't keep it clean. He kept hitting him low. And the brawl that took place at the Garden that night, unbelievable. Amazing, man. That brawl took, when I left the Garden, they had squat running in there. That's how crazy that was. They were throwing chairs. Everybody was fighting each other. Lou Duval he was on a gurney, and they were trying to get him up the steps to get him out of there because he collapsed in the ring. And he was trampled on. And the gurney almost flipped over. I mean, it was unbelievable. That night with Andrew Golota and Riddick Bowe. I'm sorry, Stormy. Yeah, I was ending that portion of it. I want to go back 1 second, if you don't mind. I was looking at St. Cruzan. My brother St. Cruzan, man. I have nothing but respect for St. Cruzan, man. I can learn anything I can learn through St. Cruzan. And he was saying that the big fight that they fought in 1951, Jake LaMotta was a little heavier, obviously, but Ray Robinson was 154 pounds. That's absolutely correct. And Ray Robinson eventually, he wasn't even a full middleweight when he fought Jake LaMotta. And Jake LaMotta was always somewhat of a light heavyweight when he stepped into the ring with Sugar Ray Robinson. But he had to tip the scales at least 160. Yes, sir. He was always walking around almost as a light heavyweight. But so that's correct. My brother St. Cruzan.
Yeah, we have some people in the chat that are offering up some historical tidbits themselves, so we should acknowledge that. St. Cruzan, talking about him weighing 154 for their big fight, and Drew Titan mentioned that Lou Duval almost fell off the gurney when they were trying to take him from the ring in the stadium because he had collapsed during that riot. Jim Lampley was famously quoted as George Foreman saving his life or something when they were rioting during that fight in that broadcast. I wish Foreman would have left Lampley down there to fend for himself, but that wasn't to be. What are some other recollections of this modern aspect of the Garden that you could throw in?
Oh, sure. Yeah, real quickly, Drew Titan is absolutely correct. Yeah, correct. Yeah, Lou Duva, that gurney was almost over. He almost flipped out, man. That was crazy. But, yeah, George Foreman had two guys by the shirt collar. He had one arm and one in the other arm, and he was holding them until the cops came. Yeah, George Foreman played a big role that night. As far as saving Jim Lampley, I think there was some more work he could have done besides doing that. But Davey Moore, we talked about Davey Moore and Roberto Duran. I'll get back to Ali and Frazier and all those other fights, Emil Griffith and Benny Kid Paret. But Davey Moore, since you asked me about the modern days, oh man, Davey Moore and Roberto Duran, that garden was packed. There was no seats available. And like I was mentioning to you before, Davey Moore was not supposed to be fighting Roberto Duran. He was supposed to fight a fighter by the name of Tony Ayala. But Tony Ayala was on a charge. He got charged, he got convicted, basically. And Roberto Duran came in at the last minute. It was on his birthday. And Davey Moore thought that there would be an easy fight for him. It was his sixth title defense. And when Roberto Duran came in that ring, he was on a mission, and you know what happened that night. Beat Davey Moore half to death. So that was a very interesting fight. But let me take it back to Emil Griffith and Benny Kid Paret for one moment. Fight took place in 1962. Now, they had several fights, fought each other 3 times. But it's because of the heckling that Benny Kid Paret, R.I.P. to him, and Emil Griffith, R.I.P. to him, that's what made it a grudge match. And that's when boxing really started changing with the NBA to the WBA because of the death that happened that night at the Garden. You had a cameraman who zoomed in at Benny Kid Paret, and he saw his eyes rolling back. This is on national television. And everyone saw that he was going into convulsions. And it really messed everything up because they had sponsorship, Gillette Razor. They stopped putting money on the fights. And they got called in the commissioner's office. Ruby Goldstein was the referee. He got called into the commissioner's office. So they had to change a lot of things. So that was a big night. I'm trying to give you some historical fights that changed the game. It was a fighter by the name of Eugene. They called him Dummy Hairston. His name was Eugene Hairston. He couldn't hear, and he couldn't speak. And the reason why that was significant is because Madison Square Garden would then add in the blinking red lights for the last 10 seconds because Eugene Hairston hit a man after the bell. And they had to do something about that because they would disqualify him, and then they wound up going into the commissioner's office. So they said they had to do something for that because you also had a referee who couldn't hear. So that's how the red blinking lights in Madison Square Garden started for the last 10 seconds with Eugene Hairston when he hit a man after the bell. So these are some historical changes that were made from some events that took place in Madison Square Garden.
If I'm not mistaken, isn't that where they had the Gillette Friday Night Fights scrapbook?
That is correct.
Yeah,
that's the Razor. They were a razor company, and they stopped sponsoring television, the promotion of the fight when that fight took place because they didn't want to be a part of that.
Yeah, and that would be another fast way for boxing when it returns from its time away to build the sport up quickly again. It's just to put it on regular TV so you can see who the young and upcoming guys are. Get familiar with them before they jump into the pool of becoming big-time pay-per-view attractions. That's the quickest way to build. You can put them on any other major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, and that's where they always built it in the past.
Well, that's when you had the Golden Glove, started in 1927, the same year that Jack Dempsey had lost his second fight, the famous long count in Chicago. You mentioned Chicago. That was Soldiers Field. That was another very popular stadium. But 1927, the New York Golden Gloves came into fruition. And you had guys like Floyd Patterson, Ray Robinson, Emil Griffith. I'm trying to think at the top of my head. Muhammad Ali, Howard Davis, Mark Breland, Hector Camacho, Jerry Cooney, I think Zab Judah, definitely Zab Judah, the Verrett brothers. You had Edwin Verrett and Adolfo Verrett. They were Verrett brothers. Adolfo Verrett fought Sugar Ray Leonard, and Edwin Verrett fought Roberto Duran twice. They all came out of the New York Golden Gloves. Emil Griffith, all of them guys. So that was a way of giving these guys opportunities to show their stardom through the Golden Gloves. It was sponsored by the Daily News. But once the Daily News newspaper stopped selling, they couldn't continue promoting the Golden Gloves. So the Golden Gloves is no more, unfortunately. But everybody got them starts with the Golden Gloves. Ray Robinson, 1939 and 1940. You had so many guys. Matter of fact, As a matter of fact, Cassius claimed Muhammad Ali. When the Chicago Golden Gloves came over to the New York Golden Gloves, Muhammad Ali was part of that tournament. So the Golden Gloves was a big way to get these names out there. And unfortunately, you don't have that anymore.
I want to say shout out to Kenneth Johnson, who sent in a PayPal donation. He says, salute Stormy B, man. Salute to you, brother, and thank you for your consideration, man. As we go through this scrapbook, we can jump past the present to past. It doesn't have to go in any type of sequence because there is such a elaborate history with the Garden. Tell us your knowledge of some fights that you attended at the Garden that maybe some of the current listeners may be aware of or may be hearing some stories about for the first time.
I've probably been to, oh man, 60 fights at the Garden. I was at the HBO tournament. You had Tim Witherspoon and Bone Crusher Smith. That fight was not supposed to happen. It was a last-minute replacement. Greg Page had an issue. And what's funny about that, just to give you one step back, Bone Crusher Smith, James Bone Crusher Smith, he was a college student. He wound up getting his education. And he was sparring with Pinkland Thomas at Times Square Boxing Ring. I mean, we don't always share sparring stories, but I'll just tell you about this fight here. I was walking up the steps. Times Square Boxing Ring was on 42nd Street in Manhattan. You had to walk up a flight of steps. They tore it down now. But Bobby Joe Young, he's the only man who defeated Aaron Pryor. He was standing in the front. I was talking to him. Had I not been speaking to him, I would have saw what happened. Hey, I got to say, shout out to my brother Curtis Sugar Anderson. Salute, my brother.
What's going on, Scrapbook? What's going on, Stormy B, man? What's up, chat?
Oh, man.
How's everybody doing?
What's happening, Kurt? How you doing, bro?
Man, I'm getting better, man. Each day.
That's good, bro. That's good. We won't ask too much of you. Just your presence and letting the audience know that you're doing better and you're on the mend is great enough for us, man, because everybody has been asking about you, sending prayers your way, and looking forward to your healthy return, man. It's good that you just put in that appearance, bro. Let everybody know you're doing good. Glad to see you.
Yeah, thanks for asking, man. People, texting me and calling me, man, and it's more than boxing, man. We're a community, a family, and I wasn't feeling well. I had the flu. It seemed much worse than that. I was really, really sick, man. But anyway, that's, water under the bridge. I'm a lot better. I'm like 80% there. I couldn't help but hearing these stories, man, about the great Madison Square Garden, man. I used to live in Madison Square Garden, watching in-house fighters like Tunde Foster and Glenwood the Real Beast Brown and Tyrone the Harlem Butcher Jackson. Matter of fact, I saw a great fight at the Garden between Ray Boom Boom Mancini and Orlando Romero that took place in 82. What a fight. And there's another fight that nobody knows about. You can look it up on YouTube. It was Leland Hardy, who later became a booking agent for the hip hop Mongol Master P. He fought a guy by the name of Ike Padilla. One of the greatest fights you will ever see, man. They were small heavyweights, so with Scrap, being at the Garden, like he lived there, which I can relate. The Garden was a very special place. It has so many great fights, man. Kevin Kelly versus Prince Nassim Hamed. I mean, we can go on and on through the history, but I used to catch the train from Penn Station Newark into Madison Square Garden. it was that convenient. And you walk up the escalator and you're in the theater. So I used to be there by myself all the time. I mean, every month they had a card, man, and it was just great to be there, man. And, seeing, other fighters, Junior Jones, seeing all of them. The Garden was a very, very special place, man. The tickets, the fights was great. You didn't never have to worry about saying a great fight. You just said how many great fights I'm gonna watch tonight, or how many great fights is gonna turn out to be classics. That's just how it was. And another great fight was the Blade Barkley versus Michael Olajide, Big Apple, Bad Blood. That was a grudge match. There's so many great fights that the Garden had over the years, man. I just miss it, man. And I was listening to you before I got on that boxing's going to suffer. Things will be back to normal. It's going to take a little time, but things will be back to normal. People is going to come out because there's no boxing being, because of the coronavirus. People can't wait for boxing to come back. So, we're highly anticipating fights. All the great fights at Madison Square Garden that took place. And we ain't even talk about Ali and Frazier. So, that's just some of my recollections about Madison Square Garden.
Salute, my brother. Oh, man, I love it, man. I'm humble, man. Thanks for coming back, man. We need you, brother.
Hey, man, I couldn't stay away, man. I ain't going to be on here too long. I'm just laying down, and I was just, thinking about, listening to the show. And I was like, I had to get into the mix, man. What's up to the chat? It seemed like it's been a year since I've been on, the chats, man. But, it's just a weird feeling, but I feel good, and, I missed the show. Last week, man, but, of course, I'm on my way back, and it's good to talk about some boxing, man. Always good.
Absolutely, man. That being said, it's like, this is why it's a community. We all have our role in the community, and when people step into their role without being asked, what happens is you get the chemistry of things getting accomplished going forward. Don't ask, what can I do? Just pick up something and start moving. And we could see that even in the chat, because once Kurt's voice came out, more names came into the chat. That means people were out there listening. But when they heard your voice, brother, it's like you awoken some sleeping giants out there. They come in, because they've been looking forward to hearing from you and everything. And that's just love and support. Appreciate that, man. And I appreciate the chat for people who have left their kind words and sentiments for Kurt, who have been under the weather, man. So that's a beautiful thing. Community.
Absolutely, man. Hey, when you can do a show with the Scrapbook Boxing, who's a phenom, man, and Stormy B, man, who's like a boxing scientist, man, it's just great to be on board. And the chat, you can't put no one in the chat, man. Without them, we wouldn't have a show. So I want to thank them, man. I'm just good to be in the mix, man, to talk about some boxing, doing something that makes you feel good. So, I'm very humble and grateful, man.
Absolutely. So, Scrapbook, you were telling us about some of the fights that you've attended. Kurt just dropped one that he had attended. Why don't you tell us, Scrap, about one of the fights that stands out to you the most, that you were able to attend, whether it was one of the big fights that we all know of, or if it was something else. But just give us a little bit of a story so we can have the audience reflect and enjoy that experience through your eyes.
I'll give you three quick ones, real quick. To finish off what I was saying as far as Bone Crusher Smith, he had knocked down Pinklin Thomas. Before I knew it, I saw Bone Crusher Smith in the ring with Tim Witherspoon. This is in 1986. This is the tournament. They were starting the tournament because Michael Spinks got his IBF heavyweight championship belt stripped when he got in the ring with Jerry Cooney. So they were trying to get this tournament going. And that fight with Tim Witherspoon and Bone Crusher Smith, like I said, he wasn't supposed to be in the ring, but he knocked Tim Witherspoon out with a knockdown rule. Now, it's something funny about that because you had a fighter a referee by the name of, was it Tony Perez? Not Tony Perez. It was Luis Perez. He was in the fighters meeting, but he couldn't understand why they didn't want to have the 3 knockdown rule in effect. The 3 knockdown rule was in effect that night, but it wasn't supposed to be. And everyone thinks that Tim Witherspoon wanted to get out of his contract with Don King, so he went down 3 times. I don't know. I was in the second row of the fight. It didn't look like that. It looked like he got stung, and he just kept going down. But what was funny about that was you had Jim Jacobs and Bill Caton. Now, after Tim Witherspoon went down the first time, Jim Jacobs had a folder in his hand and Bill Caton had a briefcase. And Jim Jacobs stood up in awe, like he couldn't understand what was happening because Mike Tyson was scheduled to face Tim Witherspoon. That was a big, big money fight. So after he went down the second time, Bill Caton had a briefcase and he threw it on the floor. And he was turning red. He couldn't believe what was happening. And then after the third time fight was over. But they started hollering because it wasn't in effect. It turns out Tim Witherspoon signed something to agree for it to be in effect. And that was crazy. Also, I was at the fight with Donovan Razor Ruddock and Michael Dokes. That was one of the most scariest fights for me because I know Michael Dokes personally. And he got clipped in the 4th round, and he was out for 7.5 minutes from the smash of Donovan Razor Ruddock. When I left the garden, he was still out. I didn't find out that he recovered until I got home and heard it on the news. So that was crazy. On the undercard, Hector Macho Camacho and Rosario. That was a big night. They called it Friday the 13th. On the undercard of that fight, you had Mike Tyson and Reggie Gross. That was a first-round knockout. I was in the second row of that fight. That was a memorable moment for me because I had already known Mike Tyson, but to see the way he knocked out Reggie Gross, and Reggie Gross had defeated, in fact, that was the first defeat for Burt Cooper, Reggie Gross. But when he knocked out Reggie Gross, that really told me that Mike Tyson was for real. So those are just a few fights that were memorable for me in Madison Square Garden, besides the Davey Moore, Roberto Duran fight and others.
Okay. Well, the imagery that I put up on the screen now is for one of the classics of all time, the fight that was one of the biggest fights in history that took place in the Garden. And it was the first match between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, known as simply the fight, the super fight. These guys, at the time that they faced each other, I would like both of you gentlemen to share your recollections of this fight and what it meant, and the fact that it took place at the Mecca. Say a little something because I don't want to pull too much energy from him, but his presence is everything. But can you set the stage for us for that, Scrap?
Sure, absolutely. 1970, Jimmy Ellis and Joe Frazier fought Madison Square Garden. It was to unify the heavyweight championship belt. As you know, Muhammad Ali had his titles, to say it that way. But what was crazy about it was Jimmy Ellis, they didn't consider him a champion. Ali's like, what is this? This is crazy. I'm beating this guy up in the gym every day. So he had to get in there with Joe Frazier. So they set the fight up for 1971, March 8th, New York's Madison Square Garden. It was one of the biggest events in boxing history. Fight of the Century was the name of the fight. And I'll let Kurt cook on that. That's one of the great fights he loves to talk about. But that fight was unbelievable. It brought out every single person you can think of. People who were not even fight fans came out. They wore minks and mink coats, leather leather jackets all the way down to the floor, and those are the men. So, Kurt, man, let the crowd know what that fight was like, man.
Well, piggyback off of what you said, people was wearing white mink coats to the floor, and those were the men, as in the words of the great Burt Sugar said. Burt Lancaster, who was a superstar, he was the color commentator, and the great Frank Sinatra was the ring photographer. You couldn't get a ticket. Oh my gosh, man. I can't put into words what that fight meant, because I remember, I was maybe, 5 or 6 years old, and I remember my father, going to the theaters and watching the fight, and my uncles. I was way too young to go. Foreman and Ali was the first fight I attended. To say that Mayweather and Pacquiao was a fight of the century is a joke, because, and I'm going to tell you something, hypothetically, if this fight was to take place this Saturday night, Ali and Frazier in their prime, it would have done, I would say, 15 million pay-per-view. Easy. Remember something, Mayweather and Pacquiao did 4.6. That fight was nothing. I'm talking about two undefeated great fighters in the prime of their careers. You very rarely get that. And the personalities, you have politifications involved in the fight. It's too big, sis. That's how big it was. I remember as a kid, even when I was 8, 9 years old, people were still thinking about it, man. To me, this is my own personal opinion, is the biggest sporting event the world has ever seen. I'm talking Super Bowl, I'm talking NBA Finals, talking about Stanley Cup. There's no championship. The anticipation of a heavyweight championship fight. There's nothing like. I'm telling you, the people years after, the market, on the sports world was unbelievable. What Muhammad Ali is the most popular figure ever, sports figure ever, and one of the most popular figures ever in general. But you have to have a dance partner, and Joe Frazier, the build up, with Howard Cosell. When I go back and look at the documentaries, I catch goosebumps. But that fight was so big, and it lived up to expectation. People just don't know how big it was, man. That's the true fight of the century. People could say Louis Schmeling. People could say Mayweather, Pacquiao, Tyson Holyfield, but there's no fight or no sporting event that was bigger than Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier.
That's exciting, man. Tremendous information there. I really respect the fact that you guys have had up close and personal experiences with that. When I was around that era, from a more distant standpoint, a fan that would tune in and everything, but I can recall the magnetism that Ali had at that time. He was like a god of boxing or something. It was like people like really, especially in the black community, because of his outspoken nature, the position he took on the draft experience that he went through, how he spoke about, racism and things like that during the civil rights movement, and how it affected his career. And there's just so much that the man, he shouldered, and he really became a champion of the people. So to see him in that coming out party with his big dance with Frazier at the Garden, that is something that is just etched in the annals of history. And I think that even upon reflection, looking back, we still cannot grasp what it was, because it's one of those things that you had to be there. You had to live through that time and that experience. You just couldn't understand what it was, outside of that. But it Scrapbook, as you recount that, what are your thoughts regarding the fight?
Oh, yeah, Muhammad Ali. See, Joe Frazier, the thing between these two guys, Smoking Joe Frazier was undefeated in his fight. He was 31-0 with 25 knockouts. Muhammad Ali was 26-0 with 23 knockouts. And this fight was destined to happen. It had to happen. Because when Muhammad Ali was stripped, you had Buster Mathis Sr. and Joe Frazier in 1968. There was a tournament that these guys didn't participate in. They fought each other for a portion of that belt. And that infuriated Muhammad Ali as well. He considered Joe Frazier somewhat of just something coming from Muhammad Ali. And all of this built up with that 1970s fight with Jimmy Ellis and Joe Frazier. So when these guys got in the ring in 71, which was destined to happen, it was breathtaking. It is breathtaking to see two quality men, undefeated, get in the ring and fight the way they did. Ali was injured in that fight, and he continued. He got dropped in the 15th round, got up and continued. I mean, I haven't seen that. Not in the heavyweight division. So that's up there. I consider Joe Louis and Schmeling only because it was a world fight between two countries. But the argument can always be made with Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier because of the Vietnam War situation with Ali, what he brought to the community. Joe Frazier was undefeated. He was a smoking machine. And to see these two guys clash, oh, man, unbelievable. I haven't seen anything like that since. Not quite like that. Unbelievable. The fight of the century.
Also, with that recollection, Scrapbook, let the people know what Joe Frazier meant as far as what he was able to do to his opponents in the ring. With his outstanding left hook, but how he left guys in the wake, after landing that shot and totally taking people out. I mean, you had people like Buster Mathis Sr., you had Jimmy Ellis and these guys, and Frazier just seemed to blow through people. And so when you saw him put Ali on the canvas late in their fight, and Ali was up at the count of 3, what does that say to you? What does that do? Can you kind of paint that picture for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's look at the guys he dropped. He dropped Eddie Machin. All right. He dropped, as a matter of fact, he was knocked down twice himself. I think it was his 11th pro fight. It could be a fight 1 or 2 off with Oscar Ringo Bonavena. Had he went down again, he wouldn't have had that opportunity to fight Muhammad Ali under those circumstances. He dropped Jimmy Ellis. The way he hit him with that left hook is a classic to this day. My dad and I used to cringe when we used to watch that fight, the highlight reels of that fight. Unbelievable left hook he threw with Jimmy Ellis. Had Jimmy Ellis walking into the ropes, when he went over to Angelo Dundee and Carrera. But Muhammad Ali in the 15th round, when he got dropped by Joe Frazier, after being staggered and hurt in the 7th and the 11th round, that goes to show the testament and the quality of Muhammad Ali. Joe Frazier fought through a broken eye socket, an orbital bone. He was blind in one eye going into the fight, and he was in a hospital for 2 to 3 weeks. This goes to show the quality and the testament.
All right. Kurt, you have something you want to add to that?
Well, Ali and Frazier, it goes a lot further than boxers. It's character as men. And you saw it, the test of wills, the intestinal fortitude, the toughness. For Ali to get up on that left hook, like it was nothing. Ali knocked out, Frazier. You knocked out Corey. Bob Foster. I mean, he was just blowing through people like it was nothing. I always felt that Ali should have had a couple more fights and then took on Frazier, would have helped him tremendously. But Frazier was a force, man. I still don't think he get his just due. The pressure that he's put on fighters, one of the best pressure fighters here with you. Tremendous left hook. He threw it with repetition. He threw it with leverage, man, and power. I mean, every time he threw it, he threw it the correct way. He hurt Ali many times with it. But Ali, for him to get up after that knockdown in the 15th round, it's just a testament of both guys, man. Even though you had a winner, but it's the boxing fans was the real winner, because you can always go back and look at that fight and critique that fight. It's one of my favorite fights that I like to look at, because you always see something different. And Joe Frazier, man, as popular as Ali was the world over, he wouldn't be Ali if he didn't have a dance partner in Joe Frazier. So, they was meant to be together like peanut butter and jelly, man. It was just, that when you talk about that fight, that's basically the pinnacle of boxing to me. It gets no better. Other people may say other fights, but that fight right there signifies boxing heavyweight championship at its most rawest moment. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier, March 8, 1971.
Yeah, real quickly, Curtis, you're absolutely right. Smoking Joe Frazier, he patted himself after Henry Armstrong. That was his idol, Henry Armstrong. And he tried his very best to fight like Armstrong. But man, what he put on that left hook, I don't think anybody ever threw a left hook like that in the past and currently. He kept coming forward nonstop. He was, like what was said, a truth machine. You've never seen anything like that before. And he put tremendous pressure. He followed you all over the ring. He pushed you from corner to corner. He beat you to the body, beat you to the head. He had elusiveness with his head, very good timing. He took punches, but he continued to throw punches. And he could break your spirit immediately if you didn't have that kind of heart that Muhammad Ali had. So Joe Frazier was the truth. I've always admired Joe Frazier. Met him several times. I was in a training camp with him one day when he was in there with Smoking Bert Cooper and his son Marvis Frazier. Joe Frazier was an unbelievable fighter. You're absolutely right, brother. Unbelievable fighter was Joe Frazier.
You want to see a vicious knockout? Go look at Joe Frazier versus Buster Mathis, man. I mean, you couldn't even see the punch. It was short and it was beautiful. The left hook that Joe Frazier landed on Mathis seemed like Mathis collapsed like a ton of bricks, man. That's a beautiful knockout.
Unbelievable, because that was the reason why Joe Frazier made the Olympic team. Buster Mathis he injured himself. And when he injured himself, Joe Frazier stepped in and he won the gold medal after breaking his thumb. Yeah, they have a history together, but that was some knockout. Unbelievable.
What do you guys think about the more modern fight that took place between a unification between two heavyweight champions? It was, my favorite fighter, Holyfield, against Lennox Lewis, and for the undisputed title. And in this fight, they had a very controversial decision that called it a draw, when people clearly thought that Lewis should have got the victory and the decision in the fight. What are you guys' recollections of that fight?
Well, to me, I thought Lewis won the fight. It was a controversial draw. and I believe in 3 rounds, and he tried. You know, I always thought something was wrong with Holyfield in some of his fight. Now, what that speculation was, I'm not going to comment on it. Right, physically in certain fights. You know, Lennox Lewis was a very, very good fighter. Some say great. I'm not a high on Lewis like a lot of people are, you know, or was, you know. But fairness to Lewis, I thought he won the fight going away. You know, it was controversial draw. I don't know what the judges look at that. It always, you know, baffles me what the judges were saying. You know, like it's some kind of, you know, politics behind it. It has to be, because, you know, you can't look at the same thing that millions of people see and say this guy won, or this guy it was a draw, or this guy won that round. You know, I thought Lennox Lewis did enough to beat Holyfield. You know, Holyfield wasn't right in that fight. No excuses. I just thought that he caught Holyfield at the right time. If this was years ago, 2 or 3 years, you know, earlier, I believe Holyfield would have beat Lewis, because even in the rematch, Holyfield fought well. I thought he hurt Lewis with a right hook in the temple in the second fight. You know, to overcome Lennox Lewis' size, you know, but you know, I thought Lewis won the fight.
Scrap.
Yeah, Lennox Lewis and Evander Holyfield. Holyfield, I gotta agree with Curtis on that. Evander Holyfield had some controversial fights in his career. It had nothing to do with him personally. It's just that Holyfield was a better ticket drawer than Lennox Lewis at that time. And although Holyfield fought his heart out, I don't think it was enough. I don't think it was enough in that fight with Lennox Lewis. Now, they had a rematch, but I just don't think it was enough to pull that one off. That was a very interesting fight leading up to that match, but I just don't think he had enough to pull it off. So I agree with Curtis on that one for sure.
I often said that if Holyfield had Lennox's body, boy, he would probably been one of the best heavyweights in history. Lennox just didn't get the maximum out, and that had more to do with what was inside the guy than anything. I do believe he was a very good boxer for his era and everything, but he wasn't the most courageous and wasn't the most aggressive guy. But with the tools and attributes he had, he got what he could out of him. But just imagine that certain guys that maybe have been undersized or didn't have those attributes, what they were able or would be able to do. It's very interesting sometimes. I remember Lennox being berated in the corner by Emmanuel Stewart to step it up and to go out there and to do things to people and stuff like that. He was like telling them, you got to talk to yourself. You got to pull yourself through this and everything. And he's telling them these things in the corner because he's trying to draw some type of fire out of such a man that is, you know, is imposing physically. And that night at the Garden, Emmanuel was talking to Lennox like that because he knew what Holyfield represented, and he had even worked with Holyfield's second fight against Bo, so he had some inside the track information. So he knew what to tell Lennox to do to Holyfield that night in the Garden, but Lennox was very apprehensive. Lennox was very wary of Holyfield's warrior spirit, and it was like he didn't want to stir that up because he didn't want to have to try to compete on that level like that because he could get caught. But I came away from that first fight wondering who in the hell supplied that protective cup that Lennox Lewis wore that came up around his breastplate, guys. Where the hell did he get that? That looked like one of those cups that you wear when you got bad ribs in the gym, and you put that on. Who said that was okay? I mean, come on. Do you guys remember that?
The same company that came out with Evander Holyfield's mouth guard is the same company that came out with his cup.
Dude, that cup was up around his chest plate. It's like that should have been, illegal. You can't land any body shots with that. But it was a stroke of genius, and I think Emmanuel has something to do with that too. He's no longer around to ask, but I would have always wanted to ask him that question. Emmanuel, did you come up with that idea because you knew Holyfield's best thing was going to be able to try to go to Lennox's body, and Holyfield couldn't go to the body because the cup was there?
Yeah, man.
But do you remember that? You remember that? Because the thing was
I do. I think I said Holyfield's cup. Yeah, it was Lennox Lewis' cup. Yeah, Lennox Lewis, man. Yeah, that's amazing. Dropped off for 1 second. I'm back, brother.
Yeah, I see. But I remember when he took the robe off, he was standing across the ring, and I looked. I was like, dude, that cup is not illegal. It's not legal for boxing. That looked like a training cup, a cup that you wear in the gym when you got bad ribs or something. Because although Lennox was 6'5", Holyfield 6'2", their height was just in inches. But if you looked at the cup that Lennox had on, that cup would come up around Evander's chest if he had it on. And I'm surprised they didn't say anything about it, bro. It's like they got away with one that night. They got away with one that night.
Yeah, they did. I want to talk about another fight. I don't want to leave some of these fights out. Roberto Duran, he fought Ken Buchanan, June 26, 1972. I believe it was for the WBA lightweight championship. I think that was the title. And it was a 13th round technical knockout. It was very controversial because they felt as though Roberto Duran not only hit him late, but he hit him low. And that won him the lightweight championship belt. Ken Buchanan was a very good fighter. He was from, I believe he was from Canada, and he just could. He was a two-handed puncher, and that was a controversy. Low blow and late. What do you think about that fight, Stormy?
Which fight was it again? I'm sorry, it faded
out. No, that's cool. That was the 1972 Ken Buchanan and Roberto Duran fight. That was in Madison Square Garden. It was such a controversial fight. Technical knockout in the 13th round. And Ken Buchanan got hit low and somewhat late. But what do you think about that situation there?
Well, I'll tell you something. Buchanan was known for a little roughhousing himself. Okay? And what's interesting about how the fight ended is this. When you can dish it, but you can't take it, sit down. Duran represented everything that was cruel and merciless and savage and everything at that time in the sport. And, of course, controlled violence method of boxing. I thought that basically when you saw how that fight wound up, his spirit was broken by Duran. Because Duran just kept coming like a wave. He just kept at him and kept at him. And mentally, I believe Buchanan buckled under the stress of matters. He realized that he couldn't match Duran physically. And then as the fight got late and wore on, he realized that he couldn't do anything to Duran mentally. And I think that he kind of he wilted, he gave in. And that's fine because like we've said, talking about the sport over and over again, there's always somebody out there tougher, right? There's always a bigger, badder monster. It is. And on that night, I think Buchanan ran into it. Sort of like, Steve Collins. You remember Steve Collins from the UK and how he kind of had that tough as nails type of mentality and disposition. But what was missing from his career is him really coming over to the U.S. and taking on some of the fighters who could have brought that out in him. See, he stayed in a safe place. Always talked about, I wanted Roy Jones so bad. Well, why didn't you come and fight him then? You see, that's the whole thing. When someone feels like they could take someone, they'll go wherever they have to go to get it done. Arrive in your backyard. Like Ali, pull up in the middle of the night with a van and a bullhorn talking outside your house. That's what you do when you want the guy. But see, these guys and Stevie Collins, he gave that impression of being that tough guy, right? But there were things he could have did to get over here to face James Toney and Bernard Hopkins and Roy Jones and Julian Jackson, but he didn't do it.
Well, that's like Joe Calzaghe, same situation. It's similar situation. He fought both of them guys, Hopkins and Jones, later on in their career. When they had their best days behind them, he didn't come over to this country to do that. I take nothing away from Joe Calzaghe. That's just a good example of what you're talking about. No question about it.
So how do you find my assessment about Duran and Buchanan, though?
No, that's a good assessment. You're right. Buchanan was a dirty fighter. He has done some things in the past. And, I think he didn't beat the count. Bottom line, they counted. He didn't get up at the count of 10, fight's over. That's the bottom line. You could get up and then he can ask for, I think did they have the 5-minute rule at that time? I'm not sure if they did. Maybe they did not. But he could have protested, but he needed to get up. He never got up.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, again, sometimes when you've been challenged to a certain degree and at a certain level, it's where you decide you want to draw your line in the sand. And I think for Buchanan, that was it. Look, we just talked about Joe Frazier putting Ali on his back in the 15th round. And Ali was up at the count of 3. In the 15th round, though, you understand? Do you know how tired you are after the 15th round? All those punches you've thrown and taken, your body's been beaten and battered, and you go down on your back and you're up at the count of 3, ready to finish. That is something right there that people just don't really think about. Especially when you see what Frazier has done to all those other guys with that left hook.
No, I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. 15 rounds, that's the proof right there. 15 rounds is the proof. And Muhammad Ali, he showed his will. You don't have guys who can do that kind of thing. And that's just the way it is. When you have John Tate and you have Mike Weaver, and Mike Weaver knocks out John Tate a minute and something seconds before the last round is over with in 15 rounds, that's another example. I mean, you have some great examples of these last-minute 15-round fights, but Muhammad Ali was a tough individual and is a hard act to follow. No question about it.
Yes, sir. So as we recall these matches at the great Mecca, man, give us a couple of great fights at the Garden that were a part of an undercard scrapbook that you can recall. It could be past, present.
I'm sorry, you had quite a few. Past, Ray Robinson when he fought Joe Escovedo in 1940, October 4th. It was on the undercard of Henry Armstrong and Fitzy Zivit. And the reason why that fight did so well wasn't just because it was a world championship fight between Armstrong and Zivit. It was Ray Robinson's debut. The way he looked in 1939 and 1940 in them Golden Gloves, because that was the closest that the Harlem residents had an opportunity to see him in Madison Square Garden, because he was in the inner city tournaments as well. He was also in the Chicago tournament. A lot of people don't realize that. But they got a good chance to see him in the Golden Gloves. He attracted a lot of people at that October 4th, 1940 fight. So that was a very good undercard fight between Ray Robinson and Joe Escoveria. Now, Joe Escoveria, his name is Ray, but Ray Robinson in the contract said you can't use Ray. You have to use your real name, Joe. So that's why he came in, and you see him on the record books as Joe Escoveria. But his name actually is, part of his name is Ray also. So the magnitude that he had during them years is really incredible. Really, really phenomenal. Another good undercard fight was Juan Laporte and Julio Cesar Chavez. That was on the undercard of Tim Witherspoon and Bone Crusher Smith, Ronaldo Snipes, and Terrell Biggs. That was one card that night. That was a very, very good card. Terrell Biggs and Ronaldo Mr. Snipes and Juan Laporte and Julio Cesar Chavez. They were on the undercard of Tim Witherspoon and Bone Crusher Smith. Those are very, very good undercards. They took place in Madison Square Garden. You also had Junior Jones. Junior Jones was knocked out by Kenny McKinley. That was on the undercard of Prince Nassim Hamed and Kevin Kelly. I was at that fight, second row. So you had some really, really good undercards in Madison Square Garden. But to stay on Kevin Kelly and Nassim Hamed, oh my God, that was some fight. That really, really was some fight. Didn't last long, a couple rounds. But both these men went down nonstop. Because of the heart of Kevin Kelly, he kept getting up. He wasn't as hard of a puncher, although he was a very hard left-handed puncher, but he wasn't as hard of a puncher as Nassim Hamed. But he took his shots as best he could. 2 southpaws in a ring. And I think what happened in that Kevin Kelly fight was Nassim got to his head. As Kevin Kelly, we talked about it in the gym. We said, Kevin, won't you? We knew what Nassim was going to do. And we said, why don't you have a card table in the ring and play cards with Phil Boza and act like this is not bothering you. He couldn't do it. He wound up standing on a strand, and he was taunting the man to come in because Nassim took a long time coming down the aisle. But that was a very good fight. Nassim Hamed and Kevin Kelly. The other good fight I wanted to touch on was Trinidad and Bernard Hopkins. Happened right after 9/11. They had to postpone that fight a couple of weeks. I was in the probably the 4th row of that fight. And that was a very heartbreaking fight because of what happened in 9/11. But Bernard Hopkins, he displayed a masterful performance. One of the best boxing exhibitions I've ever seen him fight. And I was at his first professional fight in Atlantic City. He was a light heavyweight. He lost his first fight, but he learned since then. 20 title defenses. But when he was in the ring with Trinidad, that showed me what type of master boxing ability Bernard Hopkins had. Unbelievable fighter. But that was another good fight that I wanted to talk about.
Well, let's talk about it. I remember the build up to the fight where when they were in Puerto Rico, Bernard Hopkins threw the flag down the Puerto Rican people.
That's right. Yes, he did.
He threw the flag down. They were in an auditorium, doing the presser or whatever, and he took the flag that Trinidad had been waving around. He snatched it and he threw it on the ground. And then he took off and ran. He was running out of there.
He made it out alive, man. He made it out alive.
Man, Bernard Hopkins was something else back then. It's like, to see him and how he behaves now is really like, what? But back then when he was a champion, that brother was always doing stuff and saying stuff that was like, he'd get his opponents like riled up, right? And he wanted them that way because he knew that was part of his game plan to get them in a position to do the things he wanted to do to them in the ring, technical wise. And it was a very smart ploy that he did against Trinidad to get him all upset and everything, because he was able to box and pick Trinidad apart professionally without him even knowing it. By the time when Trinidad finally hit the canvas later in that fight, he didn't realize that he was being taken to school. But when he hit that canvas, that's when he knew. And then that's also why his dad knew, and the rest is history. But it was a masterful performance by Bernard Hopkins on that night. I don't think he ever looked better. Maybe against Joe Lipsy.
Yeah, the Trinidad was perfect for him in terms of style, the contrast in styles. And I think that's one of the reasons why he was able to look as good as he did. But with a puncher like Trinidad, and to be able to be as relaxed as you could possibly be. And Trinidad, the garden really belonged to him. because he sold out the Garden every time he fought. Matter of fact, his first comeback fight, he sold out that Garden. When he came back after a 2-year hiatus, Mayoga was his first comeback fight. And he sold that Garden out then. But he really relaxed himself, Bernard Hopkins, when he was in there with Trinidad. And he popped the jab. He went from side to side. He turned him. He knew how to grab him at certain times. Oh, he just warmed down. And he took him out. Oh, beautiful display of boxing with Bernard Hopkins and Felix Trinidad. Unbelievable.
And think about this. He has victories over Trinidad and De La Hoya, who fought a big fight between one another themselves. So Bernard Hopkins stopped both of them.
Yeah, that's true. And he also wanted to fight Fernando Vargas. He wanted to go down to 154, and for whatever reason, he didn't sign. And that would have been interesting. I believe he would have done the same thing with Vargas, and he would have defeated all three of them. So that would have been interesting.
Bernard Hopkins was no joke, man. This brother, I don't think he'll get, the credit that he deserves. And part of that may be his fault. But as far as how we respect the fighters and what their accomplishments are in the ring, I totally give him up. I put him right up there under Hagler.
Yeah, Bernard Hopkins is an unbelievable fighter. He is underrated, and wow. I'm not going to rate him right here on this show, but I got to tell you, Bernard Hopkins needs to be rated very highly when you put him in the middleweight class. Now, as far as boxing history, different conversation, middleweight class, I got to put Bernard Hopkins in the top 10, top 8, for sure. No question about it. Maybe even top 5. Well, top 8, somewhere around there. He was an outstanding middleweight champion. He really was. Fought them all.
Now, did he have another fight at the Garden himself, Hopkins?
Bernard Hopkins? Yeah, Bernard Hopkins fought at the Garden, I think, to my recollection, 2 other times. Can't think of the name of the guys at this point in my head. I'm not sure if he fought Joppy at the Garden. I could be wrong, completely wrong. But I can't think of the top of my head, the names that he fought. I was at the Trinidad Hopkins fight, I can say that for sure. But I can't think of at the top of my head the names that he fought at the Garden. But I believe he fought 2 other. But Stormy, the night of gold, 1984, that was a special night. I was at that competition. And you had Pernell Whitaker, Mark Breland, Meldrick Taylor, Evander Holyfield, Tyrell Biggs. Who else was there? You had Virgil Hill.
All the guys when they turned pro that night.
Yeah. There was their professional debut. And it was amazing. It was really amazing. I remember Pernell Whitaker, he had earned $75,000 that first fight. Meldrick Taylor, I think he earned $50,000. Mark Breland, he earned the most. He earned like $100,000. He was a resident fighter out of New York, out of Brooklyn, New York. Everybody loved Mark Breland. He had 5 Golden Gloves. He was an unbelievable fighter once, Mark Breland, and he was the main guy that particular night. You also had Virgil Hill. Virgil Hill, I think he earned $10,000, and it was a 4-round fight for him. And he was a little upset about that because he had a last-minute replacement. And the guy he fought had basically all losses. But you had something else in that night of gold. I still have the shirt to this day. But that was a really good competition in 1984, the night of gold. I remember another fight with Mike Tyson and Mitch Blood Green. That was in Madison Square Garden. It was his second distant fight, Mike Tyson. And Mitch Blood Green could punch. I remember him in Gleason's gym. And when he hit the bag, you can hear it all around the gymnasium. He's very underrated as far as his punching power. But that was a very good fight. It went the distance in Madison Square Garden. Now, Troy Dorsey was in the ring with Kevin Kelly. That was at the Fell Forum, next door. You had a smaller arena. And I was sitting next to Buddy McGood and Michael Dokes, R.I.P. to him. And we were looking at that fight. That fight went to the Guinness Book of World Records as the most punches thrown. It's like 1,000 punches. Unbelievable. That was some fight. Troy Dorsey put pressure on Kevin Kelly. And it looked like at sometimes Kevin Kelly couldn't continue, but he had a lot of heart, as he did with Derek Gainer. with a swollen eye. Kevin Kelly was an unbelievable fighter, but that was a good fight at the Felt Forum between Troy Dorsey and Kevin Kelly. That was the smaller arena outside the big garden.
Yeah, that's interesting, man. You know, as we talk about the Mecca, we may have to go back and do another show in the future, sometimes down the line, of some other venues like the Blue Horizon or something like that, the Olympic Auditorium. You know, those kind of the old Chicago Stadium.
I love that.
You know. And maybe as, you know, because none of them are as big as the Garden, of course, but maybe on another show that we do, we could talk about those shows, those venues collectively, you know, this unit, that unit, you know, in one show and give the reasons why they were awesome places for fights, not a bad seat in the house, and also for the fact that the fighters who fought there. You know, here in Chicago, we also have another place. There was the Aragon Ballroom. And that was a famous place for fights going way back into the
absolutely
50s and 60s. And the ballroom, they've actually put it on the video game. The Fight Night video game. The Aragon Ballroom Stadium venue is on that video game. And I always marveled at that because I live right down the street from the Aragon Ballroom for a number of years. So to see it on the video game, I marveled at that. I was like, wow, Chicago's on the map. So, but yeah, we could do a show talking about some of those other venues because they were important and an integral part of the history of the sport and fighters who had fought there historically. And then we could get into certain names who were familiar with some of those places. You know, the Blue Horizon, and you had guys like Freddie Pendleton. You know what I mean? It's like that's where we could go with that.
Yeah, you absolutely. You had the Philadelphia ballpark. I mean, we'll go through all of those when the time comes. You had St. Nicholas Arena on 66th Street in Broadway, right across from Lincoln Center. You had the Broadway Arena, which is in Brooklyn. You had Sunnyside Garden. You had Eastern Parkway Arena. Eastern Parkway Arena, right now you have a roller skating ring there, but it used to be the Eastern Parkway Arena, 2 blocks away from Ebbets Field, where the Dodgers used to play. Oh, you had so many. We can go into anything you want to talk about, brother. Anything you want to talk about. I've studied all of those arenas, and you had some great fights. Unbelievable fights. That sounds like a good conversation.
Yes, sir. So, you know, we have maybe about 15, 14 minutes left for our show. Is there something or a fight or whatever that you would like to go into great detail about the Garden to finish off this show, and we can kind of cook on that? Any fight in particular? The Kevin Kelly fight that you mentioned, and you said that
Troy Dorsey,
yeah. That fight there, man, I remember them talking about the volumes of punches that those guys threw in that fight. Kevin Kelly was always an exciting fighter, and he would fight to the level of his competition too. If you were a very exceptional fighter at that weight class, Kevin could rise to that level, you know. And it was like, and it wasn't to say that he was an underachiever or anything. It meant that he relished challenges from opponents, you know. And I really respected him for how he went about his work and everything. Kevin Kelly was a very likable guy as far as being a fighter.
Yeah, Kevin Kelly's something else, man. I spent a lot of time with Kevin Kelly. His name was the Flushing Flash. And he was on a national team. On that team, you had Riddick Bowe, Michael Moore, Michael Carbajal, Kevin Kelly, Sergio Moro, I believe his name was, a couple of guys. And he was the focal point of that 88 Olympic team. They just knew he was going to be on that team. So Virgilio Tor, who wound up becoming a stablemate of Kevin Kelly. It was just two of them, him and Virgilio Tor. You have Phil Borza and Bill. They were the managers and trainers of him. But Virgilio Tor, he was in his hometown in Holland, and they were out there in Holland. He was a very active fighter, and he showed me a lot of tricks on the heavy bag, but he had a certain punch that was taught to him. He can move a locker, and he demonstrated in the locker room. And the lockers, you have about 8 lockers connected to each other. And he did some kind of a punch, and it actually moved the locker. Unbelievable. He was a very powerful puncher, was Kevin Kelly. But that fight at the Faux Forum, I'm sitting ringside, and I got blood splattered over me and everything else because these guys were fighting ferociously. And Kevin, he fought back. But he said later on when he got back in the gym, he said that Troy Dorsey was a punching machine. I couldn't keep him off me. He spent a lot of times on the ropes just dodging and blocking punches because he couldn't really get the punches off. But Kevin, between them two, they landed about 1,000 punches. That was an unbelievable fight that night with Kevin Kelly and Troy Dorsey. Unbelievable. Very, very good and entertaining fight.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Matter of fact, I just wanted to say Virgilio Tor, he knocked out Kelsey Banks in those Olympic Games. And Kelsey Banks, this was the first round knockout. And Kelsey Banks was one of our biggest prospects of the United States. And I think that's why Kevin didn't make the team, but Kevin wound up beating him in the amateurs as well. So there's a lot of rivalries going on at that time in New York. But I got to tell you, man, Kelsey Banks, that was an upset in the making. Virgilio Tor, he knocked him out. He had a brutal right hand to Virgilio Tor. He wound up losing to a Philadelphia fighter. I'm trying to think of his name real quickly. I can't think of his name right now, but he wound up losing to Jorge Paez, the guy I'm thinking of, a 15-round fight. But they had some good fights during that time. Madison Square Garden, ESPN and USA had a lot of good Madison Square Garden fights. Unbelievable.
Okay, now check this out, Scrapbook. We are not going to get out of this show without talking about HBO's Night of the Heavyweights in Madison Square Garden, where in the main event, I think it was Lennox Lewis and Ray Mercer. And the follow-up to the main event, I believe it was, who was it? Help me out. I know we had, in one of the fights, it was Holyfield and Bobby Ches, but there was another heavyweight fight.
Oh, yeah. Holyfield, Bobby Ches, Lennox Lewis. He's in there with Ray Mercer, right?
Right.
And who was the other guy? Was it Michael Moore?
It was one more. I just can't remember who it was.
Yeah. It's coming to me. I can't help you out with the third fight right now, but I think it might have been Michael Moore. Lawrence Williams is in the chat. I know he can help us out with that.
Yeah, Lawrence Williams. Can you help us with that?
Shout out to my brother Retro Boxing Documentaries.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, sir. Retro, yeah. Michael Carvajal was on that team, the 88 Olympic team. He was also on a national team as well, that 88 national team. But Michael Carvajal, one of my favorite fighters, man. Retro did a very good documentary with him and a guy by the name of Scotty Bulldog Olsen. And we wanted to see that fight for many years, and it got delayed. They wound up fighting, but they were both over the hill. But, yeah, Michael Carvajal was an outstanding fighter. Very good flyweight. Yeah, no, I can't think of it right now, but I remember that. Yes, I do. I just can't think of the name of these guys.
Let's see. I'm going to look it up really quickly. Because that night, it basically featured all the guys that were on the cusp, of doing something. Let's see.
Yes, you're right. You're absolutely right.
Trying to think. event. Okay, I'm looking it up right now. Yeah, Tim Witherspoon fought Jorge Luis Gonzalez.
Oh, yeah. How do I not know that? Because I'm at the fight. Why do I not know that? Yeah, Gonzalez, he had that little ponytail. He had like a bald head, and he had an extra strip of hair in the back. It was really weird.
Yeah.
And Witherspoon wound up getting to him at the end. Yeah, that was a really good fight. I don't know how I couldn't remember that, but yeah, you're right. Yep, that was the 3 cards.
I'll tell you what draws the blank on that, because Gonzalez, you know, he would go on to get knocked out by Bo and Witherspoon and everything, but Witherspoon and Mercer fought too around that time. You know, I think they fought each other next or something. So it's like that was during that era, and that's how it's easy to draw the blank, because Jorge Luis Gonzalez was not a guy who brought much to the division. Remember, he was like the Vegas house fighter or something for one of those hotels. I think it was the Mirage or something. They had brought him in and signed him to some kind of deal and promotion. And he was just fighting a bunch of nobodies, remember?
Yeah, he was the biggest thing outside of Teofimo Stevenson. You had Nino Valdez. These are all Cuban heavyweights. So he was the next thing. They were trying to promote him as the next Cuban heavyweight. But Tim Witherspoon took care of that very quickly.
Yeah. And that's why it's hard to remember that or whatever. And in the Bobby Chair's fight with Holyfield, they were complaining that Holyfield had some kind of substance on his gloves. Remember? He was saying his eyes was burning and he couldn't see or whatever. Remember that?
Yeah. It was a very boring fight. Yeah.
And that was the fight that made Don King make the fight with Tyson and Holyfield, because he felt like Holyfield had slipped so much that, like, oh, Tyson should be able to take him with no problem, because Holyfield didn't look good against Ches at all. He was hitting Ches with everything but the kitchen sink, and Ches was hanging in there, taking it and everything. But eventually, he bowed out saying, oh, he got something on his gloves or whatever. And, I think Bobby Ches got tired of getting beat up, but his chin was too damn good for his legs. His legs wouldn't go because his chin wouldn't go.
Well, Bobby Ches, amazing. I remember seeing him from the beginning. He was a middleweight. He used to fight at this roller skating rink. They called it Ice World in Totowa. And he was in there with a lot of them guys coming up, not big names. But I was at the fight when he fought a guy by the name of Mustafa Hamshaw, the Garden. My God, what a beating he took. That's when he went up to light heavy. He said, I can't do this no more, because they wanted to see him in Hagler at one point. But they were pushing him a little too hard. But Mustafa Hamshaw gave him a beating that you will never forget. I was in about the second row of that fight. And, oh, man, that was something else. That was after the beating that Mustafa Hamshaw accepted from Marvin Hagler at the Garden. I was in the second row of that fight. But he had some really good fights in Madison Square Garden. Really, really good fights.
Yeah, big time. And, when those fights took place, we always had something to look forward to, whether it was a piece of the history, whether it was the fighter and the town he came from. There was always something. And during the time that we're talking about, fighters like Bobby Ches, being from the East Coast and everything, and Holyfield, Ray Mercer, being from the East Coast, they fought on that card, fighting at the Garden. It's like that crowd, even though some of the fights, the Mercer Lewis fight was really good, the Holyfield Ches fight was so, and that fight between Witherspoon and Gonzalez was so till Witherspoon started landing those overhand rights. People got excited and warmed up off of that. But it was like the fans came out to support those fighters because they were familiar with these guys. These guys had very good amateur records and everything, and amateur fights, the history, so they were familiar. And the Garden really got charged up with fights like that. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, just take it back for one moment. When Ray Robinson met Tommy Bell, December 20th, 1946, at the Madison Square Garden, this was something big because he was the third black welterweight champion you ever had. You had the Barbados Demon, Joe Walcott, and Dixie Kid. Then you had Ray Robinson. So that was a big deal at that time. So you have these circumstances where you have fights that really are intriguing, and they're going to fill up the Madison Square Garden at that time. And I really missed the Garden. You had a lot. I mean, Benny could give you an example of what I'm talking about. We talked about Roberto Duran and Davey Moore, how Davey Moore was the hometown resident, and Roberto Duran filled up that Garden. Well, Nino Benvenuti, he fought Emil Griffith. Emil Griffith was the resident fighter, but Nino Benvenuti filled up the arena. So it's very interesting how that works out. But Madison Square Garden has so much history in boxing, you can never stop talking about it. I mean, it's just amazing of the quality championship fights you had in those buildings. Really incredible.
Yeah. So this has been a great conversation, man. And shout out to Curtis Anderson, who took a moment out of his recovery to come back and talk with us and share a little bit. We hope to get Kurt back at full strength in the near future. Scrapbook, give everybody some final words and thoughts on today's show. It's been a wonderful conversation with you and Kurt and the brothers and sisters participating in the chat. And let everybody know what's happening with your channel and where they can find you.
Well, I have a channel, as you know, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. That's where you can find me, Scrapbook Boxing. And I talk about the history of boxing as often as I can. I try to hit all weight divisions, all cultures. I want you to have a complete understanding. And the messages within those videos, I try to get you to read through the conversation that I'm talking about and relive the circumstances, and you realize how difficult it was for fighters coming up, and any ethnic, especially the black fighters. But Stormy, we're going to be going evenings soon, right? We're going to be turning this over to the evenings. Yes. We'll let them know about that probably next week or so.
Yes, the Three Wise Men of Boxing. We're going to be moving from Saturday, 10 a.m. Central, we're going to go to Thursday evening, 8 p.m. Central. And for all of you out there that have been following us at this time, we will be moving the show to this other time. And it is due to some situations where we just have to make some life adjustments. But we hope that we can still get the audience to follow us for the show. We will still be talking the same 2-hour format and everything, but we will definitely be moving. For the next show, we'll be going to Thursday evenings, 8 p.m. Central. So
yeah, look forward to it. And a special thanks to my brother Curtis. I know it was very difficult for him to come on, but that shows the dedication that he has. And I want to salute to him. We all miss my brother Curtis, and we'll see him next time, hopefully, if he's ready to come back.
Absolutely. And Scrap, when we wrap up the show, I'd like to speak with you briefly before we end the thing. So and for everybody that's out there, Stormy B, man, we got the Tuesday Tussle, Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Central, the Friday night chop session with Stormy B, man. That's 8 p.m. Central. And we still have the In the Eye of the Storm that will be coming back again every other Saturday at 10 a.m. Central. And we're looking to get our brother BFTB, the best fight the best, on the next episode of In the Eye of the Storm. So some of y'all out there who really like what BFTB has to offer, it's going to be a chance to find out up close and In the Eye of the Storm, the next guest that we'll have on that show in about 2 weeks. So yeah, I want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you. What'd you say, Scrap?
Now just shouting out BFTB. Salute to him.
Yes, sir. I want to say thank you to everybody that was out there in the chat today. We had a number of people rolling with us, making comments, and sorry we couldn't get to all of the comments because we were talking on our material, but we respect everything that you brought. Kenneth Johnson, Ronald Finkley, thank you for the PayPal donations. Appreciate you, brothers, and your support, and be looking for us on the next episode of the Three Wise Men of Boxing on a Thursday evening at 8 p.m. Central. So for my brother Scrapbook Boxing, Curtis Anderson, this is Stormy B, man. We're going to sign off for now. Say peace to everybody out there. Stay safe, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Peace.
You know, but there was a lot of intrigue in that fight. I thought it was 55-45, but Ray Mercer has one of the best chins you will ever see. You know, I mean, he has a granite chin. You know, and that fight, he was taking some shots.
I knew Ray Mercer could take a good punch, but Tommy Morrison's left hook was something that was a little bit special because, and I recognized that early on because there's just, you know, Tommy Morrison fought a lot of the guys on his way up that Mike Tyson fought, and he got a lot of the similar results that Mike Tyson got. So, you know,
that Buddy Bear fight was something else. He had him do a 360. Joe Louis hit him so hard that Buddy Bear did a 360. That's a hard punch because Buddy Bear was over 6 feet. Brutal punch, Joe Louis. I mean, his brother Max Bear. Joe Louis hit him with a triple left hook. That ended it for Max Bear. Max Bear could take punches. In fact, Max Bear was said to have been the greatest right-hand puncher as a heavyweight.
You know, but there was a lot of intrigue in that fight. I thought it was 55-45, but Ray Mercer has one of the best chins you will ever see. You know, I mean, he has a granite chin. You know, and that fight, he was taking some shots.
I knew Ray Mercer could take a good punch, but Tommy Morrison's left hook was something that was a little bit special because, and I recognized that early on because there's just, you know, Tommy Morrison fought a lot of the guys on his way up that Mike Tyson fought, and he got a lot of the similar results that Mike Tyson got. So, you know,
that Buddy Bear fight was something else. He had him do a 360. Joe Louis hit him so hard that Buddy Bear did a 360. That's a hard punch because Buddy Bear was over 6 feet. Brutal punch, Joe Louis. I mean, his brother Max Bear. Joe Louis hit him with a triple left hook. That ended it for Max Bear. Max Bear could take punches. In fact, Max Bear was said to have been the greatest right-hand puncher as a heavyweight.
You know, but there was a lot of intrigue in that fight.